Head sõbrad, kolleegid. I'm glad to introduce this today's lecture from the series of Jakob von Uexküll's lectures. And we are very glad to have here Cobus Mare from Free State University, South Africa, Bloemfontein. He's professor in translation studies, teaching both practical and theoretical translation. And in the recent years, I would say even less than 10 last years, he became one of the most active people in terms of publishing and organizing joint publishing in the world of translation semiotics. So how he happened to come here, we can probably explain in various ways, as there are always several different explanations for anything in this semiotic world, at least. So first, of course, because he has here good colleagues in translation semiotics, Peter Torop and Elin Sütiste. But then there might also be some other stories how to explain it. One of them says that actually the mainly who is guilty for that is Luc van der Slaer, who is a translation studies professor in Tartu, who more than 10 years ago started to edit this book called Translation Studies and Other Disciplines. And that border crossings, that project was such that he appointed some leading translation studies people in the world and asking each of them to find somebody of some other science to write a paper together. So here are, well, translation studies and linguistics, translation studies, and history, translation studies, and cognitive studies, translation studies, and gender studies, translation studies, and AI, and all these different. And then one is also translation studies and biology. And so he looked around and found that there is one paper now more than 20 years ago written by Peter Torop and myself on biotranslation. And so he wrote, and so without having earlier any contact at all, so to propose to write a paper together. And so it appeared here. That was, and then during that writing period, just 10 years ago in London, in the gatherings in biosemiotics, we first met each other. So then, soon after that, Cobus Mare has co-edited a book, Routledge Handbook of Translation Theory and Concepts, which is a major handbook in the area. And he has been very productive recently. 2 monographs published just a few years ago, a biosemiotic Bayer, in brackets, semiotic theory of translation, the emergence of social cultural reality, and another one, more recent, trajectories of translation, the thermodynamics of semiosis. So, and before giving the floor, I will also mention a few words of Jakob von Uexküll, because that's from that series. Simply, here you can touch the 2 books. One, what particularly makes the connection of between Uexküll and semiotics. That's Bedeutungslehre, original from 1940. And the other one is biography, Jakob von Uexküll, Seine Welt und seine Umwelt, biography written by his wife after he passed away. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Kalevi, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I have to tell you that when I first contacted Kalevi, I didn't know him at all, as he said. And then we arranged to meet at this biosemiotics gatherings. And I didn't know what he looked like. So I sort of went to the conference. As quick as I could, I would ask around and ask somebody, you know, who is Kalevi? Where's Kalevi? Which one is Kalevi? And before I could do that, as I walked in, he came from the front and he greeted me and he says, "Hi, welcome, I'm Kalevi." How do you know me? I Googled you. And I didn't think about Googling him. So Kalevi, I remember that I was completely taken aback that you went to that trouble, and I didn't. So thank you very much for that. So actually after Kalevi, I first met Ellen in 2016, 17, 18 in Belgium. And by that time I have read Peter Torp's work, but we only met, I think, 2022 in Greece, or 2021. When was the Greece conference? So it's really great to be here amongst colleagues that I've worked with and that I've read a lot. I want to thank Tiet and also Timu that I've made the arrangements with for hosting me here. Thank you very much. I must say it's something like being in heaven, I think, if there is a heaven. Walking the corridors here where such brilliant work is being done. So it's really an honor for me. And I came here to learn and not really to speak. So thank you very much also for extending that honor to allow me in this situation to also talk to you about some of my work. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of after the 2023 book, Next Steps, if I can call it that. But it's not really that much of a step. It's sort of working out implications on the way to next steps, if I can put it that way. So what I will be doing is to start with a case, with a kind of a situation, presenting you with some information about this Vredefort-Dome case, and then try to make some arguments about the materialist and biosemiotic implications for epistemic translation. So let's see if I can get this thing working. Yes. So the Vredefort-Dome is a meteorite site, impact site in central South Africa. I'll show you a map now. There it is. So there where I drew the little circle, that's where Vredefort, the dome is. And just north of it's Gauteng with Johannesburg. So it's sort of central South Africa. I live about here at this point. I was born around here. Cape Town would be here. So just to situate. So from what we know, we can construct our knowledge. And it seemed, according to information, that a meteorite of between 5 and 15 kilometers in diameter hit the Earth around about 2 billion years ago, 2.2 or 2.02 billion years ago. The initial crater was about 250 to 300 kilometers in diameter and probably about 50 kilometers deep, but it sort of immediately collapsed in on itself and was sort of immediately as in at the same time. And then for the next while, it was about 15 kilometers deep maybe. And obviously it filled up over time through erosion. So from the air, it looks like this. If you drive through there, you wouldn't see anything, right? But this is a satellite photo, so you can clearly see the semicircular form of the mountains, and also the, let's say, the ridges of mountains, one after the other. So it's like waves in a pond that you can clearly see here. This is the basis of the dome, which is now flat. It's not round, but it's flat through erosion. And you can see here on what would be the southeastern side, erosion has taken away most of the mountains. So the question is, what caused this pattern? What caused this pattern? So as early as the 1920s, a South African mineralogist, engineer, he had apparently a motorcycle and he drove through this area and he collected rocks rocks of different types. So one of the major findings that he made was that the rock on the surface was actually rock from very deep under the crust of the earth. And that obviously raised the question, so why the heck is there deep rock at the surface? And how did it get here? So there were two possible explanations. The one was it's a volcano. It exploded from inside, brought out the deep rock and put it on top. Or the other one was that the upheaval came externally. So there was impact. The impact went in deep and pushed up through the shock waves that ensued, pushed up rock and other mineral materials. So at that point, around the 1940s, there was no clarity. Was this upheaval or was this implosion? Right? It was an open debate. So in the 1940s, American scientists started to study the crater structures of the moon because preparing for the moon landing. And they found similar kind of crater structures on Earth, and they studied them, amongst others, by drilling down deep into the craters. And what then came to the attention is that the deeper down you go, the less surface rock there would be, which means that the crater was not caused by internal upheaval. It was caused by something else. So they also found these, and I don't know the geology of this, but they found these conical structures which, according to geology knowledge, indicate an explosion from above. So in the 1960s, this process developed further. Researchers working on microscopic deformations in minerals, so they could see how impact and force had an effect on the formation of minerals themselves. And they also found differences in the rims of volcanic and impact structures, and this led to the theory of shock metamorphism, which is the theory that says that the shock waves caused by a massive impact deforms or metamorphizes the geology around the impact, right? So in the 60s, internationally, the debate was closed. This is a meteorite impact site. The structures were caused by shock waves. In South Africa, however, there were continuously confusing debates. So South African geologists argue that it must have been an internal upheaval, a volcano, because the dating of the rock differed, and that could be explained through internal upheaval. So in 1987, a conference was called in South Africa. Scholars from all over the world came, but they couldn't solve the problem. However, or they couldn't concur on a solution, let me put it that way. But they decided to collaborate and try and see if they can come up with a kind of a final answer. And then in 1993, which is more than 70, 80 years after the first ideas started circulating, a French geologist, Hugo Leroux, he found two things. Firstly, he found this crystal type called Brazil twins, which are only formed in hot aqueous solutions or through shock waves. And he could rule out the hot aqueous solution in Vredefort, so it had to be a shock wave. And then the second thing he found was a mineral that could only have come from a meteorite. So there were minerals in this dome that were not from Earth, that could only have come from outside of Earth. So the matter was settled. The Vredefort dome was caused by a meteorite impact, and this came together through observations on site, through experiments in laboratories, through knowledge from all over the world, through mining expertise that became available. So it was a complex synthesis of so what happened here. So just as an aside, the impact of this meteorite was actually much bigger than the 90 kilometers diameter that is still available today. So there's proof that the impact went in a diameter of about 300 kilometers. And that impact brought deep level gold deposits to the earth. And those of you who know South African history will know that gold has been massively influential in South African history. It was discovered in the, it's been used, the alluvial gold has been known to be there for quite long, but the underground gold was discovered in the 1880s, I think, if I remember correctly, which then led, amongst others, to the Anglo-Boer War, because the British wanted the rights to the gold, to put the South African angle on the debate. There was a fight about this gold, right? So if we look at all of this, we have this question: so what or who constructed the Vredefort dome? Realists will say it was the forces, the material forces, the energy forces that caused, that constructed the dome. Or putting differently, they would say the facts proved it. Idealists or constructivists will say, well, it is only when human brains figured this out and agreed socially that this is the answer, that it became the answer. So you have these kind of two opposite perspectives, and this, I think, runs through a lot of our debates. What constructed what? So one could also ask the question, what did the Vredefort dome construct? And you could say, well, it constructed the potentialities for what became South African history. If the gold remained underground, there probably wouldn't have been a war between the English and the Afrikaans communities, and South African history would have taken a different route. But that's neither here nor there for what I'm trying to do today. So what I'm wondering about is, if the creation of knowledge is itself a translational process, how do we account for that? And I think we need, especially if we want to explain knowledge creation in also in the natural sciences, not only in humanity science, but if we want to talk about the engagement with the real matter, energy, then I think we need to find ways, and I will try and explain why and how, to include the matter and the energy in our epistemic translation process, right? Umberto Eco has done this, I think, given a first step towards this, with his discussion of the discovery of the platypus, where English settlers initially saw this thing in Australia. They reported about it. They were sent back to go and observe it. They came back with certain observations, i.e. they could see it has a beak, but it has hair. So, you know, what is this thing? And then later they could go into more and more detail until they figured out the platypus. So you can see there's clearly this iterative process between mentally translating the facts into our structures and going back to the material forms itself to do that. Bruno Latour, I think, is another one who worked on this with this kind of thing. His explanations of how a door functions in sociology, in social interaction. It goes back to include matter in the process. So what I would like to suggest for now is a kind of a synthesis between what we find in translation studies as socio-neuroscience hermeneutics, of which Douglas Robinson is the main proponent, and some kind of materialism, which we find through Karen Barrett's work and others, and then try and synthesize those kinds of ideas through a semiotic realism or a constructive realism. So Douglas Robinson is a very famous translation studies scholar who has published, he published 2 or 3 books a year. I think he has like 40 or 50 on his CV. So he has consistently been critical of Western rationalist views, and he replaced that with an embodied hermeneutic approach. Now, for him, embodied means that the hermeneutic approach is situated in the brain. It's well, in the brain body, if I can. You wouldn't say brain, only brain body. So it's an embodied social constructivist approach. It's broad, it's detailed. I think it's nicely interdisciplinary, and he tries to argue for a middle ground between constructivist and objectivist positions through the constructivism in the material brain. But the question is still, if you were to ask him, what role does matter energy play in epistemic translation? He would probably be quite ambivalent about it, and here are some examples. So you see some very realist formulations by Robinson. He says the material world keeps pushing back against our cultural grids, thwarting our efforts to synthesize, consolidate, build elegant models of reality, but also providing us with clues. So this, if you read this is quite a realist perspective. The material world has kind of an agency here, pushing back against human rationality. The question is, even if he says this, he never explains how. But there are also some really idealist and constructivist perspectives. So he would say he don't want to start with objectivist theories of causation, but he would start with Kantian constructivist periperformative theories, where the text and the author is just a projection of the reader. Right? So this is it's an empathic construct, he says. So this is a typical idealist way of saying, I, as the reader, construct the text and the author and the meaning, everything in one. So the problem here is that if knowledge is about something, we need to be able to explain the role of this something in the knowledge construction process, right? And there are legitimate provisos. I think I don't want to suggest a naive kind of realism here, sorry. So there are legitimate provisos, but I still think we need to find some way. So for Robinson, there's no recourse to brain external reality, right? You cannot go outside of what we know. The best you can do is to provide plausible explanations, and a community judge the plausibility, or a society judge the plausibility, and that's as far as you can go. And then he refers to the things that humanity studies. That humanity studies. And my question is, so what is the things that the humanity studies? And I think what I would like to add to what Robinson is doing is, we're not only studying ideas and the idealist constructions that are obviously there in culture, but we are also studying the material that underlie that. So, a turn to new materialism. New materialism is onto epistemology with many facets, and I don't think I understand everything myself, but I also don't have time to explain in much detail. But it is actually a response to the idealism that underlies much of humanity's thinking, according to them, and I think to a large extent they are correct. So they are openly about it, saying we don't think constructivism is helpful because it doesn't allow for the agency of the object about which we are constructing information. So they say it's no use only having an epistemology, like Douglas Robinson suggests. We need an onto epistemology. We need to have a view of what the world is, and we need to somehow relate to that world. So in new materialism, they side with Niels Bohr, and says the problem in our knowledge of the material world is not only that it's uncertain. In other words, it's not only an epistemological problem, it's inherently indeterminate at the quantum level. There's an ontological reason why we cannot know the world in full. It's not only epistemological reason. Right. So they say we don't observe things the way they are. Like I think we would all know, it's from Uexküll's theory, it's clear. Every species has its umwelt, and that umwelt gives it only certain access to the world outside of it. So we don't observe things the way they are. But, says new materialism, we also don't fully construct it. It's not an either-or. Rather, they talk about the relational, ecological, onto epistemology, where we have relations with the things that we observe and that we try to understand. Right? So we observe not the thing, or we don't observe only our own mind, but we observe phenomena. Our observation and the thing that we observe are entangled. They are they both play a role, if I can formulate it in that way. So Barrett talks about agential realism. We can deal with the real world as agents, as part of the real world. And much like Georgi Sprodi's work, she makes this argument that we are matter of this world that observes this world. So it's an interaction. Agential realism is an interaction. It's not something from outside that observes the world. It is the world that observes the world. It's the material world, living organisms that observe the world. And for that, she says, one has to delineate. You cannot observe everything, so you make a selection. But the selections are not made beforehand. The selection are made in the process of the observation while you are observing. And it stops being that after you've observed, next time you can observe the same thing with another delimitation, if I can put it that way. So in a typical process philosophy, she would argue that related do not pre-exist relations. And as I said, we are matter-energy things that observe other matter-energy things. So there's a kind of a tension going on here in that neurosciences emphasizes, or for me, overemphasizes the semiotic agent, and new materialism for me overemphasizes the material agent. I think if you reduce the meaning-making process, the translation, interpretation, semiotic process, to either of these, you run into problems. But how to link them, and that's really difficult. So I think that I find the Peircean conceptualization helpful here, in that the semiotic process, phenomenologically speaking, starts with the awareness of something, and you can sort of debate how much of that is sensory and how much of that is already perceptive or perception. But I think there's a kind of a start in sensory materiality, and unless you link that materiality to ideas, they remain separate. So typically, I think Robinson finds it difficult to explain how materiality links to ideation, and the materialists find it difficult to explain how materiality, the other way around. What did I say? Yeah, you will understand. You're still awake, right? So I think there's what we want is a way to explain the role of both materiality and semioticity or semiosis. So this means, going back to our example of the Vredefort Dome, that if you experience something for the very first time, you're probably experiencing a representament without an object, or for which you will supply the object as unknown, or or what the heck, or just, some kind of amazement. Imagine, I always try and imagine the first Englishman in Australia seeing a platypus. I mean, what would they have thought? It's not something that they knew. So there's a kind of unknown object, and so it seems to me that when we talk about epistemic translation or knowledge formation, that one of the issues is kind of determining what the object is. So what is this sign about? What does it stand for? So I think epistemic translation entails the creation of interpretants. In other words, this synthesis that the scientists came to, that would be the kind of a final interpretant for now, but specifically in relation to objects. And Peirce actually gives us the leeway to say that the presentiments are constrained, well, he says determined by an object. In some of his ideas, Timo Moran uses this argument in his book on the symbolosphere, ecosemiotics. I think determined is, for my liking, a bit strong, but if we say that the representament is constrained by the object, somehow the object, and this has to be determined in every case, the object has some kind of role to play. Let's call it that for now. I still need to figure out exactly what to call it. So epistemic translation is sort of translation that starts with objects and ends with interpretants, but through an iterative process. You would then also know, I think, everybody here, the difference that Peirce makes between immediate objects and dynamic objects. And for Peirce, the dynamic object is brute force, the bruteness of secondness. It need not be. The dynamic object could also be an idea, but if the dynamic object is a material thing, it has this character of brute force. And says Peirce that we can only know the object through collateral experience. And this is exactly what happened with this Vredefort Dome thing. Scholars would observe, have a material experience with the dome, take some samples, then they would go back to textbooks, they would go and find some other information about the topic, they would talk to other scholars, they called the conference together to get the information. So there was this sort of 100 years of getting collateral experience on what has happened here and what do we know about this kind of phenomenon. So you get this kind of open, complex, emergent process system that requires sometimes engaging with non-semiotic reality. I don't dispute that in many cases in culture, the object that we deal with is already an interpretant, is already meaning. But there are cases, and I think knowledge, when we talk about knowledge translation, how knowledge is created, where this first interaction with the material object is important. So for this, I think one can use John Deely's distinction between mind-dependent and mind-independent reality. So there are things, mind-independent things, whether material or cultural material, living or non-living, doesn't matter. And there are, in other words, there are things that exist irrespective of whether they are known. They just exist, and through the history of the universe, for the most part, things existed without being known, right? So they were mind independent. But then there are also mind dependent things that exist because we have thought them. A concept like freedom, for instance, exists. This building exists because it has been conceptualized by humans. I actually think that probably cultural artifacts are a mixture of mind dependent and mind independent, because this building can exist after we are dead. So it doesn't depend on our minds to exist, but in a sense it originated from our minds. A typical mind independent thing would be a unicorn, right? It has no material existence. It just exists in the mind. For Deely then, things, material things, become objects of our knowledge through a translation process. In other words, when that thing is related to an object, by means of an interpretant, we get to know it. It becomes part of our knowledge. Just note, I think you should be aware of this, but just note, Deely's use of objectivity and the common use of objectivity are two different things. For Deely, something that we know is objective because it's an object of our thought. Something that exists in itself is subjective because it's not an object of our thought. And that is completely different from how we usually use the terms. But so, just to tie up, the immediate object is always a mind thing. Obviously, in simpler biological systems, that becomes now a debate that we need to have. But I'm talking epistemic translation here, so I'm limiting myself. The dynamic object then could be either mind dependent or mind independent. So my conclusion would be that as much as the co-construction of the Vredefort Dome is an immediate object, an interpretant, that caused an interpretant, the materiality of the dome itself had an effect on this construction. In other words, you see a meaning construction process that originated in the material shape and became part of a mind world, if I can put it in that way. The question all the time was, so what is the dynamic object? How do we explain it? Was it a external or internal. So in the end, we have this kind of correlation between the signs that we create and the objects we create them about. And this is a problematic relationship, as I think you all would know. So terms like represent, it is true, my sign reflects the reality, my sign is a copy of reality, my sign system should resemble reality or correlate with reality. I think all of these have been criticized in the humanities. I'm not sure always whether that's correct, but at least it's not there's no simple one-to-one correlation between our signs and, for many reasons, and the things that we described. So I think what happens in this process is that the mind-independent existences become semiotized in mind-dependent meaning systems in a way that's pragmatic for us, in a way that we can use. So the materiality itself, for me, constrains this process. And it's not the only constraint. So there are many other constraints. Obviously, there are neurological, biological, psychological, cultural, social, disciplinary constraints that played a role here. I think all of them played a role. But I'm arguing that we should make one more space, or space for one more constraint, namely the materiality of the domain itself. And I think this becomes relevant exactly because of biosemiotics, namely that organisms and the environment are materially coupled. Also semiotically coupled, I agree. But so that kind of double meaning-making system that we need. So we are materially and semiotically entangled in our environment. So hence, I think a kind of a semiotic materialism or realism, or even a semiotic constructivism, if you want to call it that, or a realist constructivism. I'm not sure what to call it. And this obviously has ethical and political implications. So I think a perspective on life where you are the constructor and nothing else constructs you, or at least constrains you, is an unhealthy ethical position. And I think in terms of the ecological debate that we are having, we exactly want to have ethical ways of explaining the role that material, biological, cultural, social, others all play for us. So to conclude, so if you assume that epistemic systems exist, then sure, you can talk about interepistemic translation, and you can talk about how these systems are linked to one another, and I think that's a valuable approach. But if you need to explain how knowledge in the first place became a system, out of our experience with material reality, then I think you need more. So I would then say that epistemic translation is this negentropic semiotic work that we perform under the constraints of matter and energy, among other constraints, to turn sensory data into knowledge. And Google gave me that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. I hope that you will honor me with some tough questions.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
Perhaps, I don't know if it's a question or comment, but the last remark on ethical dilemmas. When we think about the kind of ecological problem we have today, then much of this problem arises from the scientific system that idealizes precisely this kind of acquiring mind-independent knowledge, or kind of knowledge about mind-independent reality. It's not so much the product of the humanistic understanding that a lot of our knowledge is, or stuff are mind dependent, or it's not a result of constructivist worldview, but precisely this very realist kind of ideal that knowledge we acquire about the world is precise and describes the reality precisely and allows us to exploit this reality. So from that point of view, I don't think the ethical problem arises from constructivist or humanity side, but from somewhere a bit different.
Yes, so I take your point. I think it would probably be fairer to say that it arises from both sides. So obviously, positivist epistemologies give you power over the material and allows you to exploit it. But I don't think the humanities is that innocent. I think a lot of what drives cultural development is the idea that in cultures we're not constrained by materiality. We use it while we're doing it, but it's a kind of unconstrained process. We don't think about the materiality of what we are doing. So, and I think now things might be changing, but I think a lot in the 19th and 20th century, the fact that we could ideationally construct dreams and ideals, and that could be constructed without reference to the material other, I think did play a role. Nature was seen as something that had to be subdued, that could be used because the other is worth less than us. There wasn't a serious ethics of the material other, I think. So I might be. I'm definitely not going to go to the guillotine for this. But I think it's probably a combination. Your point is completely valid, but I do think. Let me give you an example. I once was at a conference in Sweden where a professor of opera singing was giving a lecture. And he kept on saying, the composer is dead. The composer is dead. The author is dead. I'm the interpreter of this opera and I will interpret. And afterwards I asked him, doesn't that mean that you want to be God? And he said, yes. And that's my problem with what constructivism does, is we assign a kind of agentive power to ourselves as the only constructing factor. While if we have a semiotic view, we know that our ideas and the matter somehow have to find one another. And I'm still working out how that. That's what semiotics is about. We're trying to figure out how that works. So thanks. I think it's a good observation. Yeah.